Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much for the invitation. It's really a pleasure to join your circle and to be here. So my background is mainly in academia. I've gone a very traditional academic trajectory with a PhD, and now I work more or less most of my time as an assistant professor at the University of Amsterdam. And my background brings together, I think, three different things. On the one hand, I have a degree in law, which I studied very black letter doctrinal law in Austria. I also studied development studies, so I had always an interest in distributional questions on a global scale, global south, global north. How does that work? What is the idea of development? What does that do? And I always had a bit of a thing for theory and money in some ways. So I think these are the things that interest me most. And in my academic trajectory, I worked a lot around international economic law and how that came into being, very specifically on how the international investment protection regime came into being. And to make it a very short thing, domestic jurisdictions would usually be the ones in charge of large-scale infrastructure resource agreements that private companies have with states. But then in the wake of socialist revolutions and decolonization, lawyers and companies and states from the West started to push for an international legal regime that would protect foreign property from the domestic jurisdiction. So where there was basically national sovereignty that would decide about nationalizations and schemes of compensation, slowly but steadily, something like international investment law came into being. And I followed this process of how does law come into being? What is legal practice that makes this law? In order to look into a little bit, how is property protected? How is value protected? And in whose interest? And so I think that is something that informs also until today much of the work that I do. I then went into looking into blockchain technology, in a sense, trying to figure out what kind of jurisdiction, what kind of normative framework is being built through smart contracts, and to also follow through again, how is the distributional concept in this system? What does that mean? How can you tweak it? What can you do? And so this is then what led me into also becoming more active in experimenting in spaces that work with code, especially with Web3 technologies. So I co-founded and now direct the research at the Sovereign Nature Initiative, which works at the intersection of ecology, technology, and economics, really trying to think about what it would mean to flip the economics, as we sometimes like to call it. We have tried different expressions. We have not yet landed, but it's really the question of value and expressions of value and enabling distributed expressions of value. And I also co-direct the Logische Fantasie Lab, which is a platform that works on decentralized research modalities and how to value them, and is really very strongly interested in trying to think of what can legal concepts become through technologies, with technologies. How can we think about law, if we want to still call it law, or normativity in ways that can attend to injustices as they are being experienced every day. Yeah, I mean, I do think that really, maybe to say that in the academic work that I did for a long time, one of the things that I was chasing is the question of consent and contract, really in a very fundamental way, because the question of what moves through time, what is being protected through time, becomes a question of linguistic interpretation. And of course, then the question of what is the right interpretation and what is the wrong interpretation becomes, again, a question of the sensibility of the community to be convinced of the right or the wrong interpretation. And so in systems and formalized systems of law as we know them, be it on the domestic or on the international level, this kind of formalized linguistic interpretation is the way that it runs in many ways. And so I think that is one of the things where already a lot of questions could be asked if you speak of other modes of protecting interests, securing interests. The question then becomes, for one, what is the medium in which you do that? Because, of course, if you have letters or if you have notes, that would very much mean you have a written document and you are on the level of linguistic interpretation with that. I think that one way of looking at that differently is to think about, and this is something that is very hard to do, but to try and think about what would it mean to not presume a representational layer in which, so to speak, the world has to mold itself into so that we can make sense of it. I think this is a challenge that I at least know, Eric, in your scholarship, you have encountered in other ways. And I think that it is not the right place for me now to go into a deep dive of the question of what's the problem with representation and how does it and what are the directions to open it up. But I do think that one of the things to keep in mind is that the legal system as we know it is a representational system, and it always works on the premise that there is a real and then there is the representational layer of the real that is expressed in legal terms. And the legal terms come to really foreground and define to a certain degree what of lived experience can be expressed and how. So here's one of the challenges to think further. What does that mean? What would it mean to do that differently? Is that possible? And this, in a sense, brings me to think about materiality, of thinking of matter and meaning always being entangled, being together, being one. And so in that sense, then if we think about systems like the blockchain infrastructure, we might be tempted to make an analogy to law. It's called smart contract after all. But I think that that would be a way of cutting very short the actual potential that could come with blockchain technology in a sense. So if we again then go and overload all of that we are doing and seeing in blockchain architecture with legal terminology and legal modes of sense making. This is the contract, this is the subject, this is the object, this is the will expression, this is the... So I think that, yes, it helps making sense of what is going on to a degree. So I think it is necessary and it is meaningful that people do that kind of work of thinking through it in legal terms. But I also think that we shouldn't stop there and take maybe at face value a little bit the kinds of transactions that are taking place in a blockchain ecosystem, and see what could emerge from there. What kind of other mechanisms that do not so strongly hold on to the idea of consent being given to a certain meeting of minds, as it's called in contract law, that then travels through time and can always be secured. So if we think about blockchain transactions maybe in a different way, maybe there are interesting things here. And I think one of the axes that is especially interesting is the question of how malleable are these expressions of consent? How much is it possible to check in with them every so often and change them and have a different kind of sense for them without losing the general sense of trust into that system? And I think that this is where, at least, I mean, I have not much experience. You have much more experience with doing this through a DAO, through these kinds of mechanisms that enable moments of checking in, or however you else want to call that. I mean, it's often done through vote, but I don't think, again, that we necessarily have to call it voting, because then again, it's a decisionist setup in a sense. So maybe we can think of it in a different sense. So yeah, what does it mean to self-organize and to express that mode of self-organization in a community in an ongoing level, on an ongoing level, that you don't say, hey, here's your consent, but you said on 15th of November, 2022, that you will for always be happy to have this recording done and to have it used in every form that we want. So I think that is one of the challenges, how to do that, how to create possibility for a certain dynamic, for a certain sense of incommensurability. My consent might not be the same of that someone else's consent is, while still holding on to a certain sense of trust, to a certain sense of being reliable, and to be able to work with that kind of system. And I think that has a lot to do with community and community checking in and expressions through community and so on. So I love the work that you do. I think it's really like super cool, cutting edge in trying to do these things differently. So I think that there is a lot to be thought through together and learned from your experiences there. Yeah, I mean, I do think that there is something that I think that in my world, at least, the way to look at this is to try and not even assume a meeting of minds that can be crystallized. I mean, law loves to crystallize everything. It's crystallized into this particular state. I mean, even in the field of international law, there is a particular legal source called customary international law, and it crystallizes. So there are practices and there are ways how people think about these practices, and then there can be moments of crystallization, and then it's the rule, and then it's hard law, and before that it's not. So I think that trying to move away from this idea of crystallization that can be pinned down and described fully, and holding closer to that seems to be okay for us, whatever exactly it is that we agreed on. We are not quite sure, but right now it feels very comfortable that this is okay. And to really like take the moment in which it seems that it's not okay. I mean, this is then the dispute settlement question to a degree, so everything is fine until it's not. And when it's not anymore, the question becomes, what do you do with that? And so then the traditional mode is to go back and say, well, but we agreed on this, and this is what we said. And so here comes the fight. No, there comes the battle. Did we say this or did we say something else? Was that meant or was something else meant? And so I think approaching that with a certain, and I say really like a certain flexibility from the get-go. I mean, it doesn't mean everything goes and everything can mean everything. I mean, to a degree, everything can mean everything. But I think to hold on to a certain commonsensical understanding, I think that makes sense. And I think most people would be totally fine with that. And to then say, okay, so how can we do it so that it works? Rather than trying to go back and say, this is what we agreed on. Rather to say, okay, where does it not fit anymore? How does it not work anymore? What would it mean to tweak it so that it works again? To work with a certain comfort around the idea of not a perfect determination. And to leave it at that, and to really like be a little more, I mean, I'm throwing in this very big philosophical term in a very non-philosophical meaning, to be very pragmatic about it, and to say, what could we do so that it continues working if someone does not feel okay, and if someone has a big issue? I say that, and of course, imagining that with smaller scale questions is easier. When the more is at stake, the more difficult it becomes, and the more the sense for wanting to secure one's own realm increases in a sense. But then again, I think then it comes really to the question of distribution. Then it comes to the question of how much can be at stake, how big can the inequalities become, how much ahead can someone be, so that it really becomes a big conflict? What is the political economy that holds that system, that in a sense also takes away a certain pressure from that kind of like, no, but really we agreed. I mean, you have all of these examples with patents and with IP and with like people getting very rich for having a fantastic idea, and that just explodes. And this is a very like wealth accumulation in a very limited way for certain people. So a lot hinges on this crystallization of what is it that is actually protected. But if you have a playing field that doesn't allow for these crazy spikes, but is a little more level, then it takes also a little bit away the pressure from having to agree on what exactly is it that was protected. So I think that those two things somehow have to go together, and in both directions, we would need to open up a little bit to make that more feasible. I mean, this is such a difficult challenge where I think that I want to learn from you, because I think that for me really, or I think that there's something also where I don't know how much you have looked into this, but I think that from what we have discussed, Eric, I know that you have looked into this a lot, is of course to a certain degree, assets are protected in legal forms. I mean, if you want to wear the glasses of everything turns into a nail for the hammer of law, then within the legal field, people love to do that everything is law. No, everything is in a sense enabled by law, be it public or private law, if you want to even keep that distinction or not, or however you want to make that. There's this book by Katharina Pistor, The Code of Capital, where she really speaks a lot about how capital is encoded in law. And so I do think that one of the questions of what does assetization mean? What is the part of the legal coding of assetization? So how far can you go with legal forms? How much can you push them and break them open to do assetization in other ways? Do you go straight to commons and commoning? Is that the legal language that we are familiar with and have to hold on to? Is there something else to be thought through and thought with? How do you do that? So I do think, I think there are a lot of questions, but then for me, what is interesting, what I don't know at all, is really the question of how do you think about capital in a non-legal forms way, so to speak? Which other approaches are there to think about that, and of assetization, to think of how can you break the concept of assetization and make it do something very different? So I think there's much to, and this is where crypto again is interesting. What are these DeFi projects? In a sense, really, I know them superficially. I don't know them well. I never took the time to deep dive into how does this liquidity pool work, and what is being done where, and who is paying in what and getting what, and how is it pegged, how is it secured. I don't know well enough, and I don't understand the mechanics of it well enough, but I think that is something where I think it's very interesting to think, what would it mean to do that differently, to tap into these dynamics but do it differently. Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that I want to try to drill down a little more is really the question of how much of the problem of contract is the transactional idea of it, the equalization, the commensurability that is at heart at this idea of the contract, that you put something in and you get something out, and by that it has been equalized, and so it has to stay like this, because this is where the justice idea comes in, that you have this kind of exchange. So I think that one of the questions is really like what would it mean to think contracting in a different way than this transactional equalizer? Or maybe that is not the problem. Maybe transacting is being done in ways that have a more relational and a more community and driven and a less fixated kind of thing, kind of outlook. But I do think that really like the proximity that you find in corporate structures and other kinds of self-organizing structures, and the transactional form for any kind of exploitation, and yet in the same time the form of kind of meeting, I think is really something to unpack further. Where do you locate the problem? How do you move differently?